What you're about to hear is the part of history that textbooks mention briefly or avoid completely. It's the kind of story that feels distant at first, buried in old maps and forgotten treaties. But the moment you follow its consequences forward in time, it stops feeling like history and starts feeling uncomfortably modern. One quiet decision, made far from the people it affected, changed the trajectory of entire nations. This story explores one historical event whose real impact was far greater than most people realize. It wasn't a battle that decided the outcome, nor a revolution driven by the masses. It was a secret agreement signed in the middle of World War I that reshaped the Middle East and altered the fate of millions who never had a seat at the table. Its effects did not end with the war, they multiplied with time. At the time this story begins, the world was shaped by power struggles, survival, and imperial ambition. World War I had turned Europe into a machine of destruction, grinding empires down to exhaustion, both economically and politically. Entire generations were being consumed by trench warfare, while national treasuries were drained at unprecedented speed. While soldiers fought and died in trenches, leaders in London and Paris were already thinking beyond the war, planning for a post-war order that would protect their global interests. They believed the collapse of the Ottoman Empire was inevitable, and they were determined to decide what came next before victory was even secured or peace was negotiated. The Ottoman Empire had ruled much of the Middle East for centuries, governing diverse populations through a complex system of local autonomy and imperial oversight. This system, while imperfect, had allowed different religious and ethnic communities to coexist under a shared imperial structure. By the early 20th century, however, the empire was weakened by internal decay, economic strain, and relentless military pressure from multiple fronts. European powers labeled it the sick man of Europe, a phrase meant to suggest helplessness and decline. But sickness did not mean irrelevance, because Ottoman lands sat astride vital trade routes, controlled strategic ports, and lay above what would soon become one of the world's most valuable and contested resources: oil. Most historians agree on the basic facts of what happened next, but those facts only tell half the story. In 1916, Britain and France secretly negotiated what became known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement, without consulting the people who actually lived on the land being divided. The agreement was named after Mark Sykes and François-Georges Picot, two diplomats operating with full confidence that imperial powers had the right to decide the future of lands they did not inhabit. Their work was conducted quietly, away from public scrutiny or democratic debate. The lines they drew on maps would outlive them by generations, shaping conflicts, identities, and political struggles long after the war had ended. With maps spread across desks, they divided Ottoman Arab territories into zones of British and French control. France claimed influence over what would later become Syria and Lebanon, while Britain secured dominance over areas that formed Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine. These borders were drawn with rulers and straight lines, prioritizing imperial convenience over human reality. No serious effort was made to understand local cultures, sects, tribal boundaries, or historical relationships that had evolved over centuries. Communities that had lived separately were forced into single political units, while others with shared identities were split apart by borders that never existed before, planting the seeds of long-term instability. The popular narrative often taught in schools suggests that the Middle East instability is the natural result of ancient rivalries or religious divisions. That explanation sounds neat and comforting, especially to outsiders looking for simple answers to complex problems. But it avoids a harder and more uncomfortable truth. Those rivalries were dramatically intensified, and in many cases manufactured by borders that were never meant to create stable nations. They were designed to maximize imperial control, ensure strategic advantage, and protect European interests, not to foster long-term peace, legitimacy, or social cohesion. Behind public speeches about freedom and self-determination was a hidden reality that rarely appears in simplified histories. At the same time Britain was negotiating Sykes-Picot with France, it was also promising Arab leaders independence if they revolted against Ottoman rule. These promises were not vague suggestions, but explicit assurances meant to encourage cooperation and sacrifice. They helped fuel the Arab revolt, weakening the Ottomans from within and accelerating their collapse. Yet the independence being promised publicly was already compromised by private agreements that told a very different story. One critical moment shifted everything. In 1917, following the Russian Revolution, the new Bolshevik government exposed secret treaties made by the old imperial powers. These documents were published not out of concern for the Middle East, but to discredit imperial diplomacy itself. When the contents of Sykes-Picot became public, Arab leaders and intellectuals saw undeniable proof that independence had never been the real plan. Their future had already been divided without their knowledge, without consultation, and without consent, turning hope into lasting resentment. From that point on, trust collapsed almost completely. European powers moved forward with mandate systems that placed former Ottoman lands under British and French administration. These mandates were presented to the world as temporary arrangements meant to guide nations towards self-rule and political maturity. In practice, they functioned as colonial rule under a different name. Authority was enforced through military presence, economic pressure, and political manipulation rather than genuine partnership with local populations. As pressure increased, leaders across the region faced impossible choices. To maintain control within artificial states, governments relied on force, favoritism, and foreign backing, rather than popular legitimacy or inclusive governance. Political authority became fragile, contested, and often dependent on external support. Military coups, revolts, and uprisings became recurring features of political life. What appeared to outsiders as sudden instability was in reality the delayed reaction to a system designed without consent or accountability. The final outcomes reshaped nations, destroyed old systems, and created a new order, but not a peaceful one. Conflicts that dominate modern headlines did not emerge in isolation or by accident. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, repeated crises in Iraq, and the long-term fragility of Syria and Lebanon all trace part of their roots back to the colonial framework imposed after World War I. These conflicts are not echoes of ancient hatreds alone, but consequences of decisions made in distant rooms by people who would never live with the results. This moment in history proves something deeply uncomfortable. History is often driven less by logic or morality and more by fear, ambition, and short-term calculation. British and French leaders believed they were acting pragmatically in a dangerous and uncertain world shaped by total war and imperial rivalry. They assumed that controlling territory would naturally produce order and stability over time. Instead, they created a political system so fragile that it required constant intervention, coercion, and external support simply to survive. Even in the 21st century, the legacy of Sykes-Picot refuses to fade. Extremist groups have explicitly referenced it as a symbol of betrayal and humiliation, using it as a powerful narrative tool to mobilize anger and resistance. Beyond extremism, modern diplomatic crises across the Middle East still echo the same patterns established a century ago. External powers continue shaping outcomes, local voices are often sidelined, and borders are treated as untouchable facts, despite their artificial and contested origins. The same patterns from this historical event can still be seen in today's politics, wars, and power struggles. Whenever decisions are made about a region without meaningful consent of the people who live there, the shadow of that original betrayal reappears. These moments may look different on the surface, involving new actors and new justifications, but beneath them, the structure remains disturbingly familiar and rooted in the same assumptions about power and control. But the most important detail is usually mentioned last, or not mentioned at all. Sykes-Picot did not fail because it misunderstood the Middle East or lacked sufficient information about the region. It failed because stability was never its primary objective. Control was the real goal, and stability was merely assumed to follow as a byproduct. rather than something that needed to be built with consent and legitimacy. When the full truth is understood, this event looks less like an unfortunate accident and more like an inevitable result of imperial thinking. Land became abstract, people became secondary, and consequences were pushed into the future. That future, however, arrived, and it is still unfolding. If this deeper look helped you understand why history still shapes today's world, like and subscribe for more stories that go beyond dates and battles to explain the forces that continue to shape our lives.